He was born in a Germany still haunted by the ashes of the First World War. The cities were broken, the people defeated, but the sky remained untouched. For young Hans-Werner Lerche, that endless blue above the ruins wasn't just freedom, it was a promise. From the moment he saw his first airplane, a fragile biplane cutting across the clouds, Hans knew that one day he would be up there too, not walking among men, but flying among the gods. He built models from scrap metal and wood, often sneaking away from school to watch training planes circle above the fields near his home. His teachers called him distracted. His mother called him a dreamer, but Hans called it destiny. By the time he turned 18, destiny answered. The Luftwaffe, Germany's reborn air force, was calling for pilots. The uniforms gleamed, the aircraft shone like silver eagles, and every poster promised glory. Hans signed up without hesitation. Training was brutal. The instructors showed no mercy. Every mistake could be your last, every hesitation a death sentence. But Hans thrived. He wasn't the fastest or the strongest, but he was calm, precise, unshakable. When others panicked in the air, Hans stayed silent, breathing with the rhythm of the engine. His commanders noticed. "Lerche," one of them said, "you don't just fly the plane, you listen to it." By 1940, Europe was burning. France had fallen. The Luftwaffe ruled the skies. Young Hans found himself in a cockpit, not as a student, but as a soldier. A pilot of the Third Reich. But beneath the excitement, beneath the patriotic songs and medals, Hans began to feel something darker, something the recruiters never mentioned. He saw friends vanish into fire. He watched enemy pilots burn in the sky and realized they weren't monsters. They were boys, just like him. Each with a home, a mother, a name. Still he followed orders. Because in war, questioning orders can be as dangerous as enemy fire. Hans flew reconnaissance, escort missions, and test flights, anything the Luftwaffe needed. His reputation grew. He could handle any aircraft, no matter how unstable, no matter how experimental. If it could fly, Hans could make it dance. And so one day his commanding officer called him in. On the desk lay a new assignment, one that would change his life forever, a secret base far from the front lines. No medals, no parades, just one task: to test enemy planes, captured British Spitfires, American P-51 Mustangs, and anything else the Germans could get their hands on. Hans stared at the papers. He was a German pilot, a Luftwaffe officer, and yet he was being asked to fly enemy aircraft. The irony was sharp, the risk enormous. But deep down he felt something else: curiosity, a hunger to understand what made the enemy's planes so powerful, and so he accepted. From that day forward, Hans-Werner Lerche wasn't just fighting in the air. He was flying through the lines of history, a German ace, testing the wings of his enemies. He would learn their secrets, fly their machines, and soon find himself in a place no one could have imagined, trusted not only by his own commanders, but one day by the very men he once tried to kill, because Hans's story was never just about war. It was about what happens after it ends. The enemy's wings. The airfield was silent. No marching soldiers, no roaring squadrons, just the wind whispering across the concrete. Hans stepped out of the car, his boots crunching softly under the morning frost. Before him stood a hangar unlike any he had ever seen, and inside it, the strangest sight of his life. A Spitfire, the very aircraft he had once sworn to destroy. Its green camouflage shimmered under the dim lights. The roundel of the Royal Air Force still painted on its wings, a symbol that had haunted the dreams of every Luftwaffe pilot. Now Hans was being asked to fly it. An officer approached, clipboard in hand. "This one was captured near Calais," he said. "Barely damaged. We repaired it. You'll test it, record its limits, and tell us how to beat it." Hans ran his fingers across the metal surface. The plane felt different, alive in a way German machines didn't. It was lighter, sharper, more elegant. He climbed into the cockpit, his heart pounding. English words and gauges surrounded him, unfamiliar and strange. For the first time in his career, Hans felt like an intruder in the very sky he loved. When the engine roared to life, it didn't growl like a Messerschmitt. It sang, smooth, confident, untamed. Hans eased the throttle, the Spitfire rolling forward, trembling like a predator waiting to leap. And when the wheels left the ground, he understood instantly. This was not just a plane. This was an artist's masterpiece. The Spitfire moved with grace, rolling and diving effortlessly through the clouds. Every turn was poetry, every climb a whisper of perfection. Hans couldn't help but smile. Now I see, he thought, why they fight so fiercely. This machine gives them wings worth dying for. When he landed, the engineers crowded around, asking questions, taking notes. Hans told them what he could, about control, stability, maneuvering, but he kept one secret to himself. He had felt something that day. Respect. Respect for the very enemy he was supposed to hate. Weeks turned into months. Every few days, a new aircraft would arrive. Some British, some American. A P-38 Lightning, a Mustang, a B-24 bomber. Hans flew them all, each one different, each one teaching him something new. He began to see the war not as nations clashing, but as engineers, pilots, and dreamers, all reaching for the same sky. The Allies had their strengths. The Germans had theirs. But up there, in the cold, thin air, there were no uniforms, only men and machines. His fellow Luftwaffe pilots envied him. Some even mocked him. Flying enemy planes, Lerche. Careful, next you'll be drinking their tea. He laughed it off, but inside, the words cut deep. Because he was beginning to wonder what it all meant. What did enemy even mean when both sides shared the same passion, the same fear, the same sky? Then came the day everything changed. A new order arrived. Hans was to report to another secret testing unit, this one even deeper inside Germany. The war was turning against them. The Allies were bombing cities, the Luftwaffe losing ground. But the command believed they could still learn, still gain an advantage by studying captured planes. When Hans arrived, he saw them, row after row of Allied aircraft, lined up like ghosts of the enemy. And for months he flew them all, day after day, hour after hour, until he could tell the difference between an American propeller and a British wing design just by the sound of the wind. But deep down, Hans knew Germany was losing. No matter how hard he worked, how much data he gathered, nothing could stop what was coming. And still he flew, because flying was all he knew. It was his escape, his purpose, and his prison. By the time the winter of 1944 arrived, Hans-Werner Lerche was no longer just a Luftwaffe pilot. He was a man standing between two worlds, between pride and truth, between loyalty and understanding. He had flown his enemy's planes, and in doing so, he had touched the edge of something far greater than war. He had seen what connected them all: courage, fear, and the eternal hunger to conquer the sky. But fate wasn't finished with him yet, because soon the war would end. And Hans would face a choice that no German pilot had ever imagined: to fly it for the very men who once tried to shoot him down. The fall of the Reich. By 1944, the air above Germany no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. It belonged to the thunder, the endless growl of Allied bombers, the silver wings blotting out the sun. The sky that Hans-Werner Lerche once called home had turned into a graveyard. Every morning he woke to sirens and smoke. Cities burned, factories crumbled, and even the airfields, once symbols of German pride, were nothing but broken runways and shattered glass. But still, the flights continued, and his orders never changed. Test, record, report. Inside the hangars, men worked in silence. Engineers with hollow faces and blackened hands rebuilt wrecks that would never fly again. Mechanics whispered rumors of Allied landings in France, of Russians advancing from the east. No one knew which enemy would reach them first. But everyone knew it was only a matter of time. For Hans, the war had become something different now. It wasn't about victory anymore. It was about survival. For the men around him, for the machines, for his own sanity, he still flew every day, though the runways grew shorter and the fuel scarcer. He flew Allied planes, German prototypes, anything with wings. He said it was for the data, but deep down it was for the silence. Because up there above the ruins he could forget, if only for a moment, the world falling apart beneath him. One morning, in late March of 1945, he arrived at the airfield and found the hangar almost empty. Half the planes were gone. The rest stood in pieces. His commanding officer, Colonel Kessler, met him at the door, his uniform stained and torn. "We're evacuating," he said simply. "Orders from Berlin. Burn everything you can't take." Hans stared at him. "Evacuating to where?" Kessler looked at the sky. "Anywhere that isn't here." The next few hours were chaos. Engines roared to life, papers were thrown into fires, and soldiers hurried to destroy what little remained. Hans helped where he could, but his mind was elsewhere, on the planes that had once filled this hangar. The Spitfire, the Mustang, the Me-262 jet prototype. Each one told a story. Each one had given him something to believe in, even when belief itself was dying. As the sun began to set, Hans made a decision. He walked to the last surviving aircraft on the field, an American P-47 Thunderbolt, captured months earlier and hastily repaired. He had tested it once before. It was strong, heavy and loud, not graceful like a Spitfire, not elegant like a Messerschmitt, but indestructible. He climbed into the cockpit. Kessler shouted from the hangar, "Lerche! Where are you going?" Hans started the engine. The propeller spun, kicking up dust. He shouted back, "West!" The colonel's voice was lost in the roar. Hans had no plan, no map, no destination. He only knew one thing. The war was ending, and if he stayed, he would die for nothing. He lifted the Thunderbolt off the ground, the runway falling away beneath him. The smoke of burning machines rising into the evening sky. The landscape below was unrecognizable. Rivers of fire cutting through cities. Convoys of refugees moving like ants through the ruins. He flew low, staying out of radar range. His hands steady despite the pounding of his heart. He didn't know if the Allies would shoot him down or if the Germans would mistake him for an enemy. All he knew was that he couldn't fight anymore. For hours he flew west, over forests, rivers and towns that no longer existed. The fuel gauge sank lower and lower, and the horizon glowed red from distant bombardments. He thought of the friends he had lost, the boys who once joked about medals and victory, now buried in unmarked graves. He thought of the engineers who had built the planes he flew, their genius wasted in a war none of them could win. He thought of his mother, somewhere in Berlin, waiting for a son who might never come home. As dawn broke, he crossed into territory held by the Allies. He saw smoke rising from an airfield below, not German, but American. Hans hesitated. His fuel was almost gone. He could land and surrender, or keep flying until the sky ran out. He circled once, then made his choice. He lowered the landing gear and brought the plane down gently, carefully, onto a runway marked with white stars. The ground crews below stared in disbelief. A German pilot landing in an American plane. It didn't make sense. They surrounded him, rifles raised, shouting in English. Hans raised his hands slowly. "Nicht schießen," he said. "Don't shoot." The soldiers dragged him from the cockpit, searched him and shouted questions he barely understood. One officer looked him up and down. "Your Luftwaffe?" Hans nodded. The officer's eyes narrowed. "And this plane?" Hans smiled faintly. "Yours." They didn't know whether to laugh or arrest him. They did both. He was taken to a makeshift camp, a converted farmhouse surrounded by barbed wire. For the first time in years, Hans was grounded. Days passed, then weeks. Interrogations came and went. Questions about bases, fuel depots, secret weapons. But soon, the tone began to change. The American officers seemed less interested in punishment and more in understanding. How had he flown their planes? How had he kept them operational? How did the Germans repair them? Hans answered honestly. At first, because he thought it might save his life. Later, because he realized it might save others too. One day, a colonel entered the tent, tall, calm, with the kind of face that had seen too much war. He sat across from Hans and said, "You've flown every Allied plane we've built, haven't you?" Hans hesitated, then nodded. "Almost everyone," the colonel smiled. "You know them better than most of our own men." Hans didn't answer. The colonel leaned forward. "We could use someone like you," Hans blinked. "Use me? I'm your enemy." "Not anymore," the colonel said. "The war's over. It's time to build something new." Hans didn't know what to say. He had spent years believing the Allies were monsters. Now one was offering him a second chance. In the days that followed, the Americans moved him from the camp to a small airbase in France. There he met engineers, test pilots and officers, men who had fought against him, yet shook his hand as if he were one of them. They wanted him to fly again, not as a soldier but as a pilot, to test captured German aircraft, to help them understand how the Luftwaffe had flown, how their machines had worked. It was the strangest twist of fate imaginable. The Luftwaffe pilot, who once studied Allied planes, was now flying for the Allies, studying his own. At first, Hans resisted. "You're asking me to betray my country," he said. One American engineer replied softly, "Your country betrayed you a long time ago." That night, Hans couldn't sleep. He sat on his bunk, staring at his hands, the same hands that had held the controls of Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs and Spitfires alike. Hands that had killed, saved and somehow survived. He thought about the war, the leaders who had lied, the soldiers who had died, and the machines that had carried them all to their fate. And somewhere in the quiet of that French airfield, Hans realized something simple and terrible. The sky didn't belong to nations. It never had. It belonged to those who respected it. And if flying for the Allies could help stop another war like this, then maybe, just maybe, it was worth it, so he agreed. The next morning, Hans-Werner Lerche stepped onto the tarmac, the rising sun glinting off the wing of a captured Messerschmitt 262, his homeland's pride, now wearing American stars. He climbed into the cockpit, the familiar smell of oil and steel filling his lungs. He closed his eyes for a moment, then he smiled. "Let's see how she flies," he said quietly. When the engines ignited, the sound echoed across the airfield, not as a symbol of war, but of something new. A German pilot flying his own nation's machine. For peace, he took off smoothly, rising into the same sky that had once been filled with fire. For the first time in years, Hans felt no fear, no guilt, no orders pressing on his shoulders. Only freedom. Below, the American engineers watched in awe as the jet streaked across the horizon, leaving behind the smoke of a war that was finally over. For Hans-Werner Lerche, the fall of the Reich wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something no one could have imagined, a second life. In the same sky that had once nearly destroyed him, flying for the enemy, the world Hans-Werner Lerche woke up to was unrecognizable. The Reich had fallen. The swastikas that once hung over cities now lay trampled in the mud. Berlin was in ruins. The men who had sworn a 1,000-year empire were either dead or hiding behind lies. And yet, somehow, Hans was still alive, standing on a foreign airfield, surrounded by the flags of the very nations he had once fought to destroy. For the first time in his life, he didn't wear a uniform. He didn't carry orders. He carried only his past, and a strange, fragile trust. The Americans called him Hans, never Herr Lerche. They treated him not as a prisoner, but as a colleague, a pilot, a technician, an aviator who had something they didn't, knowledge, experience, and a gift that couldn't be denied, the ability to make machines obey him, no matter their origin. At first, the arrangement felt absurd. A former Luftwaffe pilot sitting in a briefing room with American officers, discussing flight characteristics of German aircraft. He half expected to wake up back in a prison camp, the entire thing just a dream born of exhaustion. But day after day, it became real. The Americans wanted him to fly their captured planes, Me-109s, FW-190s, even the jet-powered Me-262s that had terrified Allied pilots in the war's final months. They wanted to know how these aircraft worked, what they could do, and how to improve their own. To them, Hans wasn't the enemy anymore. He was the key. The first test came quickly. A dusty airstrip in occupied France. A team of engineers waiting beside a battered Me-109, its black cross painted over with white stars. Hans stood beside it, silent, his hand tracing the familiar curve of its fuselage. He had flown dozens of these before, as a hunter, as a killer. Now he would fly it for the men it once tried to kill. He climbed into the cockpit, the smell of fuel and steel hitting him like a memory. The controls felt the same stick, the same pedals, the same weight under his hands. But something was missing. The flag, the anthem. The orders shouted in his ear. All gone. He started the engine. It coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. The American ground crew watched from a distance, uncertain whether to trust him. When he released the brakes, the plane leapt forward like an old warhorse remembering battle, as the ground blurred beneath him and the Me-109 climbed into the air. Hans felt something strange. Not guilt, not pride, but peace. He wasn't flying for a flag anymore. He was flying because it was what he was born to do. The flight lasted 20 minutes. He looped, rolled, climbed, and tested every limit he knew by heart. When he landed, the Americans clapped. It wasn't the roaring applause of propaganda films. It was quiet, genuine, almost respectful. One of the engineers shook his hand afterward. You flew her like she belonged to you. Hans smiled faintly. She did. That night, he sat alone in his quarters, thinking about what had just happened. For years, he had fought for Germany. Now he was flying for the enemy, and yet somehow it didn't feel wrong. Because in the air there were no enemies. Only pilots. Over the following weeks, he tested aircraft one after another. Each one carried a story, a scar, a memory. The Me-262 jet, fast, sleek, deadly, still bore bullet holes from the day it was captured. The Focke-Wulf 190, his old comrade's plane, still smelled of burnt oil and cordite. And then there were the Allied planes, Spitfires, Mustangs, Lightnings, the ones he had studied in secret during the war. Now he could fly them openly. He laughed to himself the first time he saw the American markings on a Spitfire. So, he said quietly, we've all changed sides now. The American engineers watched everything he did. They filled notebooks with his observations, his comparisons, his descriptions of flight control and engine performance. They admired his precision, his calmness, the way he treated every machine as if it had a soul. One day, an officer approached him after a test flight. You know, he said, you could have a future with us. Test pilot, instructor, maybe even consultant. Hans didn't answer. He simply looked at the horizon, that endless blue that had never cared who owned it. As the months passed, trust began to grow. The soldiers stopped calling him the German. They started calling him our pilot. He ate with them, drank with them, shared stories of the war. Not with bitterness, but with a quiet understanding that only those who had flown could share. Sometimes, when the whiskey flowed too freely, one of the Americans would ask, "Did you ever shoot one of us down?" Hans would pause, then say softly, "Yes." The room would fall silent. Then someone would raise a glass and say, "Well, here's to the ones who made it down alive." They would drink together, former enemies, now brothers in the air. But it wasn't easy. Every time Hans took off in a German plane, painted with Allied colors, a part of him felt torn. He wasn't sure who he was anymore, a traitor, a survivor, or simply a man who refused to let politics ground his wings. He received letters from home, what was left of it. Old comrades wrote to say they were rebuilding, others that they could never forgive him for working with the Allies. One letter, unsigned, said only, "You betrayed the fatherland." Hans read it once, folded it, and placed it in a drawer. He never opened it again. The Americans, for their part, didn't treat him like a trophy. They genuinely wanted to understand. Some even admitted that their own aircraft owed something to the German designs. "You people built incredible machines," one mechanic said, and smiled sadly, "and used them for terrible things." There was a day, late autumn, 1945, when he was asked to fly a P-51 Mustang and a Messerschmitt Bf-109 back-to-back to compare their strengths. Two legends of the sky, born from opposite sides of the same war. and spent hours in each cockpit, testing turns, climbs, dives, and energy retention. When he landed, the engineers gathered around, eager for his verdict. He looked at them and said, "They're both perfect." "In their own language, what do you mean?" one asked. "The Mustang speaks in freedom. The Messerschmitt speaks in precision. Both are beautiful. Both are deadly. And neither should ever have been built for killing." No one said a word. From that day on, Hans wasn't treated like a former enemy. He was treated like a philosopher of flight, a man who had seen both sides of the sky and survived to tell the story. Months turned into a year. The world outside was rebuilding, factories humming again, nations drawing new borders. But for Hans, life remained suspended in the air, a quiet limbo between war and peace. He flew not for glory, but for understanding. He flew to keep the sky alive in his memory, to make sure that the lessons of war were not forgotten among the clouds. Sometimes, standing on the runway at dusk, he would look up at the fading contrails of Allied bombers returning home and whisper to himself, "You see, we all fly the same way. We just aim in different directions." The Americans eventually assigned him a permanent role, technical advisor for captured aircraft operations. It was more than a job. It was a strange redemption. He would inspect the wrecks of old Luftwaffe planes, salvaging parts, explaining how German engineers had solved problems of aerodynamics and design. He showed them the secrets of the Me-262's engines, the flaws in the FW-190's frame, the genius behind the Bf-109's climb rate. One American captain said after watching him work, "It's almost like you're talking to them." Hans nodded. "I am. These planes were alive once. They deserve to be remembered for what they were, not for what they were used for." He became something of a legend among the Allied test crews. The man who had flown for both sides. The pilot who could take any machine into the air, no matter how broken, and bring it back safely. But beneath the respect, there was always a shadow, a quiet melancholy that never left him. Because every time he flew, he thought of the men who didn't come back. German, American, British, it didn't matter anymore. In his mind, they were all the same, pilots swallowed by the same sky. And so, when he was finally offered citizenship, a chance to stay in the West and continue flying for the Allies, he politely refused. "I was born in Germany," he said. "I will die there. The sky belongs to everyone but the ground. The ground remembers who you are." He returned home a changed man. Not a hero, not a traitor, just a pilot who had lived too long in the air. But the Americans never forgot him. His reports were studied for years, his insights shaping aircraft designs that would dominate the skies for generations. And somewhere, in a dusty archive, his name was written beside the words, "Hans-Werner Lerche flew for both sides, but belonged only to the sky." The irony of peace. The war had ended, but peace, Hans soon realized, was not quiet. It had a strange, uneasy hum, the sound of factories roaring back to life, of nations rebuilding, of the world trying to pretend it hadn't just torn itself apart. Germany was no longer a proud empire. It was a scarred land divided by lines on a map. In the West, the Americans built schools and runways. In the East, the Soviets built walls and silence. And somewhere between those two worlds stood Hans-Werner Lerche, a man who had flown through both skies and belonged to neither. He returned to a homeland that barely recognized him. The uniforms were gone, the medals meaningless. No one cared about test pilots anymore. People cared about bread, about warmth, about staying alive through another winter. Hans found work wherever he could, repairing engines, rebuilding damaged aircraft, writing quiet reports for the few companies allowed to design civilian planes. He rarely spoke about the war. When people asked what he did during those years, he would only say, "I flew," but flight had changed. The sky was no longer filled with danger or fire, only the slow, steady hum of peace. Passenger planes rose where bombers once climbed, and pilots wore smiles instead of sidearms. For Hans, it should have been comforting. It wasn't. Every time he saw a contrail stretching across the clouds, he thought of the men who never came home, the ones who vanished into smoke, into history, into the silence that followed every explosion. He often visited the airfields that survived the war, now empty or converted into farms. He would walk along the cracked runways, his boots echoing softly, and imagine the sound of engines rising once again, the hum of courage, the whisper of danger. And then he would remember what those sounds had cost. One afternoon in 1948, an envelope arrived. The sender was American. Inside was a letter, carefully typed, signed by a name he recognized, Colonel James McIntyre, the officer who had once offered him a second chance. It read, "Hans, we have not forgotten what you did for us. Your test reports remain invaluable. Your understanding of flight has saved lives. If ever you wish to return to the skies, our doors are open." Hans smiled when he read it, then folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. He knew he wouldn't go back. He had flown enough for 2 lifetimes. Now he wanted only to remember, not as a soldier, not as an engineer, but as a man who had seen the sky from both sides. Still, sometimes he couldn't help himself. He would visit small airstrips where gliders and private planes practiced, and he'd offer quiet advice to young pilots. "Listen to the wind," he'd tell them. "It speaks before the instruments do." They didn't know who he was, just an old man with sharp eyes and a soft voice. But when he spoke, they listened. In time, stories began to spread again, whispers among aviation circles about the German pilot who had flown for both sides. Journalists came searching, historians wrote letters, and veterans reached out from across the world. They all wanted to understand the same thing, how a man could fly for his enemies and still keep his honor. Hans never gave them a simple answer. He would only say, "The sky has no borders. Only men draw those." He lived simply in a small apartment overlooking an open field where children sometimes played with paper airplanes. He would watch them for hours, smiling faintly as their creations looped and dove, their laughter echoing through the wind. It reminded him of who he used to be, the boy who once dreamed of touching the clouds. But even as peace settled into his bones, a question lingered, one he could never quite answer. Had he survived the war, or had he simply kept flying through it? The sky remembers. Time, like altitude, changes everything. By the 1960s, Hans-Werner Lerche was no longer a name found in newspapers or archives. He was a quiet man with silver hair, walking through a world that had forgotten the noise of war. Yet for those who remembered, he was something rare, a bridge between enemies, a symbol of what the sky could teach those who dared to understand it. He still kept a collection of flight logs, each page filled with careful handwriting. Some bore the insignias of the Luftwaffe. Others carried small Allied markings, drawn in pen by the Americans who once flew beside him. Each line was a memory, each altitude a story. One day an American journalist found him. He had been researching the history of captured aircraft testing and had stumbled upon the name Hans-Werner Lerche. When he arrived at Hans's small home, the old pilot welcomed him in with tea and silence. They talked for hours about engines, wings, the feel of flight. And finally, the journalist asked the question that had brought him across the ocean. "How did it feel," he said, "to fly for both sides?" Hans thought for a long moment before answering. "It felt," he said softly, "like flying for the sky itself." He looked out the window as he spoke, his eyes fixed on a contrail gliding far above. "You see, the sky doesn't know uniforms or languages. It doesn't care who built the plane or who gave the orders. It only asks one thing: do you respect it?" The journalist nodded, scribbling in his notebook. Hans smiled faintly. "You can write that down," he said. Before the man left, he noticed a photograph framed on the mantel. It showed a young pilot standing beside a Spitfire, the enemy's plane, with a cautious smile on his face. "Was that you?" the journalist asked. Hans nodded. "Yes, the day I stopped being at war. When the article was published, it spread quietly among aviation circles. The story of a man who flew for both sides, who never fired a shot again, who found peace not on land but in the clouds. For a while, letters came from around the world, from pilots, historians, and even veterans who had once fought against him. Most simply said thank you. Hans replied to some, but not all. He didn't need praise or recognition. He had already received his reward, the chance to grow old, to look up at the sky and know that he had helped turn it from a battlefield into a bridge. As the years passed, his health began to fade. But even then he would sit by the window each morning, watching the airplanes overhead, jetliners now, smooth and silver, faster than anything he had ever flown. He would whisper under his breath, "We did it! We made it safer." On a quiet evening in the early 1970s, Hans-Werner Lerche took his last walk to the small airfield near his home. The sun was low, the air cool. He sat on a bench overlooking the runway, hands folded on his cane, eyes tracing the path of a glider taking off in the distance. He smiled. A young pilot passing by recognized him, or perhaps just sensed who he was, and asked, "Do you miss it? Flying?" Hans's answer was barely more than a whisper. "Every day," he said. "But I'm still in the sky. Every time one of you takes off, I'm there." That night, he passed away quietly in his sleep, as if he had simply taken one final flight into the clouds. In the years that followed, his name resurfaced in archives, documentaries, and aviation journals. Historians debated whether he was a hero or a survivor. Pilots called him something simpler, one of us, because in a century where men fought for borders drawn on maps, Hans-Werner Lerche had flown beyond them. He had crossed the enemy lines not with a weapon, but with understanding. And in doing so, he proved something that the war had almost destroyed, that even in the darkest sky, humanity could still find its wings. His logbooks now rest in a museum, pages worn and yellowed, the ink fading, the numbers still precise. Visitors read his notes, flight stable, controls smooth, engine reliable, and rarely noticed the quiet poetry hidden in those words. But those who know, know. They see a man who once belonged to no country, no flag, no side. A man who flew not for victory, not for vengeance, but for understanding. And when they look up at the sky, wide open and forever free, they remember him. Because the sky remembers. It always remembers.